embassy in Egypt, in Cairo, reopened after, if you recall, 4 years back, the riots in Tahrir Square in Egypt spilled over and to the Israeli embassy, and it was ransacked by a raging Egyptian mob. And ever since, it's been closed for obviously for security reasons. Today it was opened, reopened, which is a significant and more than a symbolic thing, given what I'm about to discuss, which is the challenges and opportunities in the changing Middle East that that Israel is living in. And for the past few years, it is indeed a drastically changing Middle East. It's a region that has been thrust into a very long period of instability and uncertainty. I think it's a good starting point from which the entire region has been thrust into that era is the Arab Spring, or turmoil in Arab countries that took place as of January 2011, and whose repercussions we feel now and we will feel for many, many years to come. What's important, we're not going to analyze that deeply right now, but it's important to realize that the Middle East we thought we knew is not the Middle East that we look at and experience today. It's a period of instability and uncertainty that produces almost constantly a changing dynamic that no one could have foreseen. It raises and topples leaders and major actors in a way that no one could have anticipated. No intelligence service in the world anticipated the Arab Spring, but no intelligence service in the world anticipated the fall, for example, of Mubarak in Egypt. No intelligence agency in the world, Israel included, anticipated the rise a year later of the Muslim Brotherhood. No one anticipated their demise or their fall just a few short months afterwards. No one anticipated the place ISIS will occupy in the regional dynamic. No one anticipated the implosion of Syria, the civil war in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. And Israel is right there, smack in the middle of it all of this turmoil that it itself is not, it finds it very difficult to prepare for, because it comes as a great surprise. And we have to adapt ourselves to this radically changing, constantly changing situation, and adopt a new way of looking at our neighborhood. Because the old ways, the old doctrines, according to which we interpreted our neighborhood, simply do not hold. For example, those of you who are students of history know that the entire geopolitical boundaries in the Middle East were pretty much formed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement just over 100 years ago. And they held water for nearly 100 years. For the first part of the 20th century, it was the colonial powers of Great Britain and France who pretty much drew those boundaries that enforced them. And for the second part of the 20th century, the autocratic Arab dictators in most Arab countries held those boundaries together. Well, those dictators, by and large, are gone, and we see those boundaries and the very concept of a nation state in the Middle East disappearing. We see Syria fracturing into its ethnic and tribal groups. We see Libya going the same way, Yemen. We see the old guard being thrust out, or in the process of being thrust out in many of those countries, and a new guard not yet taking root or taking the helms in its own hands and steering those countries in a clear path forward. The way we used to view the Middle East is we used to associate countries with their leaders, because those leaders were there for decades. And we used to think that the trajectory of a particular country, in order to understand it, all we have to do is understand the way of thought of the leader of that country, the Arab dictator of that country. You wanted to know where Libya was going, you kind of figured out what Gaddafi was thinking and what he had in store, and you knew where Libya was headed. Same with Egypt, with Mubarak, and with Syria, with Assad, the father and then the son. Public opinion or civil engagement had nothing, in that former perspective, had no impact on the trajectory of those countries. All of these assumptions, all of these doctrines, according to which we interpreted our surroundings, are no longer valid. Where is Gaddafi today? Or Mubarak? Or Assad? Assad may be the strongest warlord in Syria, but he certainly is not the head of, doesn't control Syria. Is it still a country? A nation state? For sure it isn't. So in this situation, where the old guard has been thrown out and no one has yet assumed full effective control of the situation, a vacuum has been created, understandably so. And that vacuum in the entire region is being exploited. And it's being exploited primarily by radical Islamic movements that are looking to assert their control over those territories, over those areas. Hence, ISIS, the Al-Nusra Front, which is sort of a page out of the Al-Qaeda catalog, Hezbollah, Hamas. Beyond the Middle East, you can see it in Africa as well, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and other places. These geopolitical vacuums that we are experiencing in the Middle East, and are also experienced in other parts of the world, are typically exploited by radical elements of sorts. And in the Middle East, these are radical Islamic elements. And it doesn't matter whether they're Sunni or Shiite. What binds them all together is their determination and resolve to impose their radical point of view and worldview and value system, which is diametrically opposed to our own, on the rest of the region and the rest of the world. They may fight amongst themselves, if it's ISIS and Iran, for example, whether it'll be the Sunni or the Shiite version of that radical doctrine that will be imposed. But both of them want to impose on the rest of the region and the world their very radical version of Islam. And we all know that they don't, every means is kosher in that respect. That's a very serious challenge, not just to Israel, but to the rest of the world, because we're not talking about just an ordinary terrorist organization. We're talking about significant institutions, and if you will, terrorist organizations, but that hold state-like assets. such as land, population, financial capabilities, natural resources, and a great deal of ammunition and weaponry. And they don't abide by our rules. Their moral system, they don't have one, not according to what we define as morality. Human rights, laws of combat, of appropriate combat, they don't apply. So how do you triumph? How do you engage in such an asymmetrical warfare with such players who don't play by the rules? And you know, last summer's war with Hamas in Gaza is a perfect example. What do you do in a situation where your enemy hides between its own civilians and compromises its own civilian population, and actually lures you towards hitting its own civilian population, while at the same time, you know, throwing rockets and missiles at your civilian population? How do these are some of the dilemmas that not just Israel but the entire world faces today with respect to how to handle these very dark forces, because they're dangerous. They have in their minds a mission. They are on a mission from God to impose their set of norms and beliefs on the rest of the world. What are those norms and beliefs? Or let me first of all backtrack and say that we in Israel, first of all, are looking at this evolving reality from the lens of both threats and challenges, and also opportunities. I mentioned Egypt and the reopening of the Israeli embassy in Cairo today. So many of those threats by these terrorist groups are not directed only, or not even mainly, at Israel. They're directed primarily towards the Muslim population in the countries in which those terrorist organizations have taken root. But they also don't like Israel very much. So we have a lot in common with some of those countries who are threatened by the ISIS's and Iran's of the region. Egypt is a case in point, and we are cooperating a lot with Egypt on counterterrorism in the Sinai, in Egyptian territory, where many of those organizations have opened up shop. But I have to say, as Israel looks at some of those challenges, I think they can easily be divided into two categories: Iran and everything else. And by everything else, and I'm not minimizing the significance of everything else, but everything else includes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Hamas, and Hezbollah, and ISIS, and everything, really everything else, because none of the very disturbing, I would say, developments in the region constitute what we might call an existential threat on the state of Israel, except for one, and that is the prospect of the most dangerous regime on the face of this earth, which calls for Israel's destruction day in, day out, that is Iran, gaining access to the most dangerous weapon on the face of this earth, which is a nuclear weapon. That we do consider to be existential, an existential threat. And when the Supreme Leader of Iran today says that in 25 years, and he said that today, Israel will not exist, and day in, day out threatens to annihilate it, and he says it today, after having signed the nuclear agreement with the entire world, and supposedly he's supposed to be playing nice. He's supposed to to demonstrate his goodwill and his good intentions. Something doesn't sit well. And I'd like to, since this past month, we've been so heavily engaged in discussing the nuclear agreement with Iran. Allow me for 1 minute, if I have it. Do I have it? For a few short minutes, or long ones. Really elaborate a little bit on that, on Israel's concerns with regards to the agreement that was signed with Iran. So first of all, let's understand who we're dealing with. We're dealing with a regime whose value system includes the legitimizing stoning of women on major street squares for the crime of adultery. I don't want to trouble you with visuals. Don't try to Google it, but if you will, you'll find a few examples that were taped of such stonings. They're not a very pretty sight. It's a regime that deems as a legitimate hanging in public in soccer stadiums that are packed with people from cranes, gays and lesbians and dissidents. And Iran holds the #1 record in the world for public executions, surpassing China in that respect, in absolute numbers. And it's a regime that is bent ever since it underwent its Islamic revolution in 1979, is bent on exporting terrorism throughout the world, and is considered, not by me, but by the US State Department, as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And it does all of that for the sole purpose of living up to what the Islamic revolution is all about, which is imposing those norms that I just mentioned on the rest of the world. That is God's will, and that is what God decreed as the #1 mission of Iran's mullahs and ayatollahs. And that is the only reason why Iran is pursuing a military nuclear capabilities. Iran does not need a nuclear program in order to generate electricity. It certainly doesn't need 20,000 spinning centrifuges in hidden locations, underground locations, concealed from the rest of the world in order to switch on the light. It doesn't need an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile program. The I, by the way, intercontinental stands for the United States, in case no one paid attention. It doesn't need it for any other reason than to tip those missiles with nukes and launch them, or threaten with launching them. Doesn't need to launch them, it can also threaten to do so. But that really is the only reason Iran is developing such a robust nuclear program to begin with the intention of getting to a bomb that will enable it more easily to export the revolution that it deems is its mandate and mission to do, God-given mission. And so, understandably so, the #1 objective of any nuclear deal with Iran, and that's how it was set out to be, is to prevent Iran from being able to do that, to gain access to military nuclear capabilities, to prevent it from continuing to develop its already robust nuclear program to a point where it can actually gain, master the technology to create a bomb. That would be the rationale of an agreement with Iran over its nuclear program. But what the agreement accomplished is the exact opposite. What the agreement accomplished is, or what the outcome of this agreement is paving the way for Iran to a nuclear bomb, and to more than one nuclear bomb. Now, there are many reasons why, and I have to tell you, one has to exercise here too a little bit of humility. This agreement is 159 pages long with 5 annexes. I'm not a nuclear physicist. Many of the technicalities are not ones that I can comprehend or understand. But I'll tell you why this agreement is flawed. Not just, I'll skip the details. I can go into them if you'd like, because I have read it and I'm pretty well versed in it. But it is fundamentally flawed, and that's what I want to stress. And it's fundamentally flawed because it is predicated on legitimizing Iran's nuclear program, and in that nuclear program, its right to enrich uranium. Now, when you enrich uranium, you could use it for good, and you could use it for bad. There's nothing to stop a country that has the capability to enrich uranium from eventually enriching it to a weapons-grade level and using it to produce a bomb. So predicating the entire talks and subsequent agreement with Iran on its legitimacy to enrich uranium that will eventually enable it to get to a nuclear bomb is just, it doesn't make sense. It's legitimizing what you want to prevent, and doing so at the very outset. Not only that, even to the degree that there are limitations in this agreement on Iran's nuclear program, and there are some limitations, they have an expiration date. And that expiration date is, in global terms, tomorrow morning. 10 years from now, the vast majority of limitations on Iran's nuclear program under this agreement are going to be lifted. That means that 10 years from now, we're going to wake up to a reality of Iran being able to do practically whatever it wants. Now, how will it be able to do whatever it wants? Because not only does the agreement legitimize its nuclear program, and not only are the limitations on that program lifted in 10 years' time, but all of the infrastructure of Iran's nuclear program remains intact on Iranian soil. So yes, they have to switch some of the centrifuges off and store them for a period of a few years. But guess what they're going to do once the terms of the agreement are lifted? They're going to switch them back on again. Only then they're going to be much more sophisticated, because they will have developed more advanced versions of those centrifuges and more sophisticated ways of getting to what they want even quicker. So for all these reasons, this is a very bad agreement. It achieves the exact opposite of what it wants to achieve. I'll tell you what does not have an expiration date. Iran's determination to wipe Israel off the map, as you heard today from its supreme leader, and bring death to America, that does not have an expiration date. Now, at the end of the day, the Persian civilization is a very illustrious one, dates back over 3,000 years, and it's one that is responsible for a lot of progress of humanity over the years. It's a respected civilization, but today it's it's in one of its darkest hours. And I believe, just like it took communism 7 decades or so to disappear. This dark hour will disappear too. But to predicate an agreement of such significance on an assumption that maybe in 10 years from now Iran's going to become a Jeffersonian democracy and everything is going to be good, that's just folly. That doesn't make any sense. So, yes, we're very concerned. We think that the agreement that was signed with Iran spells disaster for the reasons I mentioned, and they are the macro level. They're the the fundamentals of the agreement. Once you do delve into the details of the deficiencies in the inspections regime, lack of an enforcement mechanism, a conflict resolution mechanism that's based on consensus, by the way. Guess who is part of that consensus? Iran, of course. So what are the likelihood of arriving at a consensus when Iran's in the room and you have to negotiate that consensus with him? Of details that have to do with possible other military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program that are not really going to be looked at in any significant way. And more, when you look into the details, it's even more troubling. But I wanted to share with you, beyond the details, why, from the very fundamentals, this is a very, very bad agreement. And I wanted to elaborate on that because really that's been what we have been engaged at for a very long time, and will continue being engaged. I'm familiar with the numbers in Congress and with what's going to happen on the Hill. We're not here to meddle with that. We're not here to dictate the political process here. We're here to share our concerns, and I think public opinion also matters quite a lot. And public opinion in the United States, according to polls I read, indicate that 2/3 of the American population is very concerned, shares those exact concerns that I've outlined. I think I'll almost stop here. I'll just say that, again, going back to where we started, the reason I am optimistic is because in the 3 years that I've been here, I've really met so many people like each and every one of you. And we've held together as a Jewish people through highs and lows, and faced many challenges throughout our history. In the broad perspective, as I said at the beginning, we're very fortunate. We're living in one of the good points in our history, and we should embrace it and continue leveraging it, so that 2,000 years from now, there will be another Consul General speaking in front of another Dona Gracia Hadasah group, maybe not in this room, but in a similar setting. So I want to thank you very much, and happy to answer questions.
So we're going to have a short Q&A, but we're going to have a rule, which is, please make sure if you're asking a question, you're asking a question and not making a statement. We really don't have time for that, and I will step in because I really would like questions for the Consul General.
Yes, we'd like to ask. To get the agreement, let's say that...
Stand up and so
Speak loud.
Okay.
So people could
I
hear.
would like to ask, what's the alternative to this agreement? I mean, what would you like to see? Because I don't know what it should be.
The question was, so what's the alternative to the current agreement? The alternative, there can be several alternatives. First of all, the alternative to doing something so colossally bad The obvious immediate alternative is not to do it, right? Okay, so but now it's been done. So what are the alternatives? The alternative is